All right, it's 2 o'clock. So welcome everybody. We are now going to go live on Facebook. If any of you have Facebook, you can go to the Disability Voices United Facebook site and do a watch party, which I always do whenever I am, whenever we do our webinars. So you can go to Facebook, find Disability Voices United, and have a watch party. So I'm going to get started as soon as we go live with Facebook. Let me know, Ed, when you think that happens. Usually it says it up at the top.
Still processing, should be just a few more seconds.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to get started as soon as we go live on Facebook. And we're also going to go very slowly at the beginning because this is the first meeting we've ever required registration. And so some people are accustomed to just clicking on our links and getting right into the webinar. And now they actually have to register and then get the link to get in. So we're testing this to see if it creates too much of a barrier. And if it does, then we will just not collect people's email addresses. All right, the webinar is now live on Facebook, so we're going to get started. My name is Judy Mark. I'm the president of Disability Voices United, which is an organization directed by and for people with disabilities and family members. We are part of a statewide coalition called Disability Vote California, which is probably 30 or 40 organizations now who are part of it, who represent self-advocates, family members, professionals, regional centers, others who are committed to ensuring that people with disabilities have the right to vote, that we encourage them to get out the vote, as well as their family members and the staff and other professionals who support us every single day. This is the third in our webinar. And so before I get started, and I probably should have said this earlier, for those of you who require Spanish interpretation, in a moment, I'm going to be asking Lorna to tell you all how to find that interpretation, and we use a backline to provide accessibility. So Lorna, when you're ready, go ahead and tell folks in Spanish how they can access it.
Para las personas que hablan español, para escuchar la interpretación al español, llamen al 551-241-6310. De nuevo, 551-241-6310. No se necesita código de acceso. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. Today's topic is a very, very important one. But I'm so excited that someone else is going to moderate it. But we are really excited to have you all at our third webinar of Disability Vote California. What we are going to do at the beginning of every webinar is we're asking a self-advocate, a family member, and a professional in the field to talk about why they vote. And we're taking each of those testimonials and we're putting them on Facebook, in social media, and really pushing them out so that people understand that we have a stake in this election, whether it's local, state, or national. We have a stake in this election because we are people with disabilities or family members or professionals in the field. So the first person I want to introduce to speak about why she votes is Kisha Weller. Kisha Weller is a staff member at the Tarjan Center, which is University Center for Excellence at UCLA. And Kisha, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. Why do I vote? My vote is my voice. By voting, I can help create positive change for Americans in the future. I vote because my voice matters. I vote because it's a civil rights matter. I vote because we need to end disability discrimination. I vote because it's a human rights, equal rights, and healthcare issue. I vote because I can make my own choices. I vote for affordable housing. respect, and inclusion was for people with disabilities. I vote because we need equal opportunities in employment. I vote because we need accessibility for public transportation. I get all my voting information from Disability Vote California website. Click the vote.
Thank you, Kecia. That was amazing. I like the crypt the vote at the end. I think Andrew was very pleased with that as well.
Of course.
Now I'd like to introduce Suzanne Bennett Francisco, who is a parent of 3 individuals with disabilities, 3 young, amazing people. And Suzanne, why don't you tell everybody why you vote?
Well, like she said, I have 3 young adults who have congenital muscular dystrophy and autism. They are joyful, they're cunning, and they'll reprogram their entire communication device to make sure you know what they're capable of. So I really am passionate about voting so that I can represent my children. And like Kecia said, your vote is your voice. And for people like my children, they don't have a vote, a voice and a choice unless we're voting for things that help them get accessible supports and services, which includes their devices and the circle of support that can help them in their lives. And having a circle of support in your life is important if you have a disability, also because they can help you to vote, just like the rest of us need help to vote and to understand what's on the ballot and how we can vote. And basically it's a power that allows us to educate other people about what's important to us, and home and community-based services and integration in the community and inclusion and self-determination. So we want to be looking for candidates who are going to address those areas that are important to us and hold them accountable for things like IDEA and some of the things Kecia talked about, housing and employment, and home and community-based services is something that's coming in the future and is very important. So these are the things that we can look to see if they're important for the people that we're voting for. And I did want to also say that I think a lot of parents like me think that they don't have time to vote, but of all the many, many things that we have to do to advocate for our loved ones in our lives, this is the one thing that takes the least amount of time, and there won't be someone on the other side of the table arguing with you. So that's, which is in and itself a delight, you know, right there. But it's very impactful. It's the most important thing that you can do for your loved ones in your life. So please tell everyone to come out and vote, and encourage people in your life that you know that have differences and who are exceptional, that they can vote, and Disability Vote California can teach them how to do that.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Really appreciate that. Finally, I want to introduce Sara Iwahashi, who is a staff member at North LA Regional Center and is very passionate about this issue as well. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Judy. Hello, everyone. My name is Sara Iwahashi, and I work in the Public Information Department at North Los Angeles County Regional Center. I vote because it is my right to vote, and I don't take that for granted. I believe that my vote can make a difference, and I want to have a say about who my elected representatives are. I've been really fortunate that the work that I do has helped me to be more informed and feel empowered when it comes to voting. At North LA, a few of our legislative advocacy activities include hosting candidates forums and organizing grassroots visits to meet with our representatives. My role is to help plan and promote these types of events. Participants at some of our past candidates forums are current state legislators, including Senator Scott Wilk, Assembly members Tom Lackey, Adrian Nazarian, and Christy Smith, to name a few. Being able to hear candidates respond to questions related to the disability community and other important topics has been really informative, and it has had an impact and an influence on how I have voted. We also participate at ARCA's Grassroots Day in Sacramento every year, where we send 1 to 2 teams of people who meet with our state legislators, and we visit with our legislators at their local offices. Over the last few years, we've increased the number of our grassroots visits, and we interact with our elected representatives at other community events and meetings. We want to make sure that they know who we are, what we do, and help them understand the issues that are impacting our community. Because we've cultivated these relationships, we have representatives at the state and local levels who have demonstrated their support. I have seen the positive effect that legislative advocacy can have, and personally and professionally, I feel much more empowered when it's time to vote. And these are things that anyone can do. If there's an opportunity to hear a candidate or an elected representative speak about their positions on issues and the work that they are doing, I encourage you to participate. You can also call your representative and schedule a meeting with them or their staff the way that we do with our grassroots visits. Your representatives may also offer events such as community coffees and town halls or open houses, and these are really great ways to get to know them and have them get to know you too. So I hope you will join me when it's time to vote in November and get to know your representatives. They are working for us, and we want to make sure that they are supporting our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. That was so great and really amazing work that you were doing there at the Regional Center. So before we move on to the main part of our webinar today, I just want to tell everyone in our audience how we're going to proceed following our presentation. For those of you who are in the audience, we do not have people ask questions directly. The two ways you'll be able to ask questions is through the chat, although it's not my preferred way, but mostly what you should do in the chat is to share information with other attendees, as well as if you have a technical question, you can certainly ask that in the chat. The best way to ask your question is through the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. It has two sort of word bubbles in front of it. If you ask the questions, I'll be able to monitor those, and I'll be able to make sure that those questions are asked to our speaker. Now what I'd like to do is to introduce the moderator of our next, of the main part of our webinar, and her name is Marianne Kehler. Marianne is first and foremost the parent of awesome Liam, who is a good friend of my son's, but she is also the vice president of the Autism Society of Los Angeles and a real well-known advocate in the disability community. And I want to thank her for moderating the panel today, or the speaker today. Go ahead, Marianne. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks to everyone, Kecia and Suzanne and Sara. It was really a pleasure to hear you. So it sets the tone for us quite nicely. I was informed that I am the slide manager, so it's a big responsibility here. And now I get to have full and utter control, which Judy knows is something I'm happy to have here. So the first thing I want to do is welcome our guest, Andrew Pulrang, and Judy knows this, and I think Andrew may have heard this as well, but I'm a huge fan of Andrew's, and this was a delight for me to have the opportunity to be the person who gets to chat with him in the fireside chat. If you do not already follow Andrew on social media, I highly encourage you to do so. I'm going to share with you the considerable accomplishments that he has. He's in particular a fantastic writer about disability and the intersection with policy, politics, and culture. Kecia did a shout out to Crypt the Vote, and you can see why here, because Andrew is, along with Alice Wong and Greg Baratan, the founders of Crypt the Vote discussion hashtag that I think really well encapsulates a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So Andrew, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this discussion a lot.
So we're Disability Vote California, but you're in upstate New York, and I'm a fellow upstate New Yorker, although inside joke for you and I, you would call me a downstate New Yorker because near West Point, which we call it upstate, but you're really upstate.
Right, right. I'm up by Vermont and Montreal, that kind of thing, and the Adirondacks. Yeah.
Yeah, you're legitimately upstate. I'm a faker. But yeah, but so welcome to California. Welcome to the issues that we're dealing with here. We're really grateful to have you. I'm going to just, Judy had introduced me, and Judy, thank you for that. But I just wanted to make a point that in addition to being a parent of a high support adult who has a disability, I also have a couple of invisible disabilities myself. So I wanted to talk about that with Andrew, because I think that there are ways that we tend to define what a disability is and tend not to think about the broader community that and the issues that affect those of us with disabilities. And the other thing I wanted to mention for the folks who just talked about what they vote for, my son is a passionate voter, and that we tend to not include individuals with intellectual disabilities in the population who should be considered able to be a part of this electoral process. So hopefully we'll talk a bit about that too, Andrew. Yeah, this really jumped out at me, and I wanted to start with this because this quote comes from an article that you recently wrote that was in Forbes. And what I loved about this quote is that it's so simple, but it says a lot. And what it says to me is that, and it reads for those who aren't seeing the screen, it says, candidates talk about what we ask them about. Sounds simple and it sounds logical, doesn't it? But what that tells me is there's so much of a reciprocity about the role that we need to play in the process of making sure that the policies that we care about are on the table, and then the corresponding responsibility that candidates have to listen to us. So I love that quote, Andrew. Thank you for that.
Well, yeah, I'm looking at it now and thinking about what's happening right now, these past weeks or two, the next few weeks. At this point, I think that's kind of aspirational. Like, it's hopefully they talk about what we ask them about. You know, thinking more about it, I think that that is very much more true between elections and maybe in like the primary early parts of elections, when candidates are still kind of exploring and staking out their views and what they're going to be for and against. That's really the prime time when we can have an impact. Not that we can't now, but I think in the home stretch, candidates are kind of locked and loaded into whatever they're going to do for the next few weeks. And probably, you know, maybe we don't have as much of that informal influence that we maybe had a few months ago, but we've always got the vote. That's the whole point. So
Andrew, at Disability Vote California, we were talking exactly about what you just said, which is, so we're 60 days away from the election today, yeah. Right? Exactly. So we are exactly 2 months from the election. So as you point out, a lot of the platforms are locked and loaded, right? It is what it is. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the power in front of us for the next 2 months, that's the onus seems to be on us as disabled voters to make sure that our voice is heard. And part of what I would like to encourage of us, and this is the conversation we've been having at Disability Vote California, is also thinking about the long game. Right now, the urgency is around the election, November 3rd. But I think the long game in terms of, as you said, how we continue to keep the dialogue going on the issues and the policies that are important to us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, you know, however the elections turn out, we have to continue what we've been doing. It's good, you know, depending on the outcome, our strategies will probably have to be different, and maybe even our priorities. But generally speaking, you know, our concerns are not going to go away either way when the election is over. You know, there's not only just the presidency to be thinking about, it's all the congressional elections, all the states that have governor elections and legislatures and all that, and all of those outcomes have an impact too. So definitely as you say, the long game is always there. That's why when we started doing Crypt the Vote, it was really just a spur of the moment thing early in the 2016 election, because we were sick of not hearing about disability. And we said, well, we'll just start talking about it ourselves. And that's why we didn't stop when the 2016 election was over, and why we didn't stop when the 2018 midterms were over, because we realized it wasn't just about election years, it's about all the policy and politics that go on between.
So you must be like me when you're listening to candidates talk, and they talk about the different constituency groups that they're addressing. Are you like me where you hold your breath and wait and see if they say the word disability?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, honestly, more so a few years ago than now. And I think, not that it's not important, but I think my expectations have gotten a little bit more, I don't know, deeper, maybe even more nuanced. It's like, I'm really looking for more substance. So I don't necessarily focus just on, do they say disability, but it's very noticeable when they do, because it's so rare. Yeah.
So when we look at, so there's some data up on the slides here for those who aren't looking at the screen. 61 million disabled adults in the US. 23% of California voters are disabled, which is slightly lower. It's on average about 1 in 4 across the country. It's 23% in California. The power that we have is incredible. So let's talk about that, Andrew. When you mentioned, federal election, but also local elections and how important they are. Something that I was really intrigued about, that we kind of shared your article around the coalition. You talked a bit about the difference between engagement and voting. So can you explain a little bit about the role of disaffection in lower registration rates that we have in the disability community?
Right. Well, what I did was I had some questions in my mind about, I had seen research done by Lisa Schur and I forget his first name, Schur and Cruz, who are professors at Rutgers University, have been doing research on disability voting patterns really since the year 2000. And, they tend to show statistics about how many people registered, how many voted, what the gap is between registration and voting, between people with disabilities and people without disabilities, to try and just, show, is there a voter gap? And if so, how big it is? And if so, from year to year, does it get bigger? Does the gap get bigger? Is it getting narrowed? And as I dug into their research a little bit, I noticed that they had statistics on the reasons people gave for why they didn't register or why they didn't vote. And they offered up, like, you could choose, probably was a multiple choice question given to people, and the choices they had were a bunch of them. I forgot, it was too difficult to get it done, there were too many barriers, or things like, I didn't care who won, or the issues didn't speak to me, or I don't think my vote really matters, or I didn't like any of the candidates. So some of them were practical barriers, like I couldn't do it, I couldn't get there, I wanted to, but it wasn't able to manage it. And then another group was what I would call disaffection, where it's like, not so much, I don't want to say they don't want to vote. I feel like when you say that, it's like a judgment on the disabled person. And I think it's better to describe it as disaffection, which means somehow feeling unattached or like out of sorts on the whole thing. And yeah, I found I found from looking at the research is that there is over the past 2 elections, there has been some disaffection among disabled voters, but it's a little less than among non-disabled voters. So I think that we can't say that disabled people are especially disaffected, because that would be an argument that somebody might make, right? They might say, well, maybe you vote less because you don't care. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. Even in 2016, where there was a lot of disaffection, a lot of, oh, I don't like either candidate, generally speaking, non-disabled people were more on that side of disaffection than disabled. So yeah, I mean, I just think that's an interesting thing, and it'll be interesting to see after this next election what the situation is going to be. Will it be shown, will we be voting in greater numbers than last time? If so, will disaffection go way down because we're more motivated, or is it going to be about the same, or is it going to be less? That's just an interesting thing to look at. Yeah.
I was going to say, if we had a magic wand, Disability Vote California, if we had a magic wand, our hope would be to increase the numbers of people who are registering, and then of course increasing the numbers of folks who actually are voting.
Yeah.
So keeping in mind what those barriers might be, what do you see as our role in the electoral process?
Well, at this stage, and again, I come back to where we are right now. My instinct would be that although practical barriers are hugely important, and there's still work to do to make sure that nobody is left out because of the physical inability or the barriers, right? I do think that what we may neglect if we're not careful is the disaffection side. And the flip side of disaffection is interest. And I think activists are going to be fine, right? We're already motivated, but most disabled people are not full-time activists. And I keep worrying that there's still people with disabilities out there who are right now thinking, oh, there's an election? Oh, God, what a pain. Oh, gosh. I hate all this rhetoric, yada, yada, yada. Doesn't make any difference. Has nothing to do with my life. So I feel like the campaigns have the first responsibility to reach out and say, no, we've got stuff for you. There is reason for you specifically to vote. But also groups like yours and like Crypt the Vote, like any voter coalition. I think part of our mission right now is to simply say to people, it really does matter. It's not just, you should vote because it's your right, although that's true. There's reason for it. And here's what they are. And if you want to know about it, here's where you can go to find out.
So that's a great segue. Let's talk about that, because obviously we may be more affected than the average person, right? I mean, when you think about the issues that matter to us. So let's dive into, the topic of this is, what are you voting for? And we've been putting a lot of that out into social media as well, because there's so much that we are voting for, isn't there? So in no particular order, but I'm going to start with employment, because obviously right now, employment is a topic that matters to everybody. In the disability community, it's no secret that our unemployment numbers tend to be higher by a bit. So what can candidates put forth that will create structural reform to positively impact employment for workers with disabilities? I know that's we're talking for an hour, right? Like with this list, you and I could be talking for 3 days, but.
Well, first of all, what candidates do all the time is say, I will fight for better employment. End of story, and then move on, right? We don't know what that means, usually. They might say, well, I'm going to fight for enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a little better. That's a little more specific, but still, what exactly you're going to do that. But I feel like there are a couple of issues that we could pinpoint that would get more to the heart of the matter. One is ending sub-minimum wage, where the laws from the 1930s that allow some employers to pay some disabled people less than minimum wage for the work that they do. I think that's not necessarily a direct, like, it will increase employment. It's a matter of, well, for those who are employed in those jobs, they should be paid better. We need to move the whole system to everybody getting fair pay for their work. So that's one very specific thing. And it's something that only government really can do. That, I think candidates should be for, and many of them are in favor of that. The other thing I would point out is the issue that's been around forever, which is the disincentives that are built into the benefit systems of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Everything's got a threshold where if you work, but you work too much, you lose benefits that you absolutely need. And if you didn't have those benefits, you wouldn't be able to work. So it's a catch-22. And candidates have rarely addressed that until this year. And they're finally starting to put in their policies something about undoing, they call it getting rid of the benefits cliffs, disincentive, that type of thing. So yeah, those are two employment areas that I think probably could do a lot to change the employment picture.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was very excited to read what you wrote about that, because I think that would be a real game changer for us in general. So the next topic that is of real interest is long-term care, and I think I was thinking about this before today, and I confess that I hadn't really put together that there are 4 generations in my family that have been affected by this. So my mother spent many years caring for my grandmother at the end of her life, who had ALS. In turn, my mom lived with me for the last number of years of her life, and had often, was using a wheelchair and other things, which opened me up to firsthand experience of accessibility challenges and things like that I hadn't had to experience firsthand before that. And now my adult son, who lives independently with supported living services and has gone on to live an independent life through the benefit of having the kinds of supports that are very difficult for many people to get. So particularly thinking about COVID, it's like when we tend to think about long-term care, it's a broad spectrum of folks that we're talking about, isn't it? And so can you talk a little bit about that, Andrew, in terms of who's affected, and why should candidates be talking about this both locally and federally?
Well, and I think this goes right to the issue you mentioned earlier about people having a different idea of who constitutes the disability community. So, one thing that we, even back in 2016 and before, a lot of us have always been puzzled why candidates haven't brought it up more often, because even if you get away from the sort of very self-conscious disability, we are the disabled, we are the disability activist community, et cetera, what about all the older moms and dads that, practically every family has, where they're in a nursing home, or they might have to go to one, or assisted living or home care, or some, they can't care for themselves anymore, quote unquote. And all these families have to worry about it. And a lot of them are worrying, I would say worrying in the dark. They don't know what's available. The choices they make depend a lot on what services they happen to stumble over or if they go to the right this office, that's the service they get because it's the only one they know about. But why aren't candidates all saying we've got to do something about this, because practically every family deals with it, and that also affects people with disabilities of all kinds. So yeah, I mean, it should be a much more prominent issue than it is, and I we're still waiting for it to be really encapsulated. Although again, the candidates this year took things a lot further and promoted a lot more specific policy fixes to address long-term care, and specifically the ability for people to live in their own homes and live independently, not have to go to nursing homes or other facilities, and have that choice of not doing that.
Yeah, I have a feeling that this is an issue that many people don't realize hits home for them. Mm-hmm. And it's the rare person that it doesn't at some point affect.
I think that for a lot of people, it's, again, I'm not talking about the people that are, in a sense, part of the disability community in the conscious sense, but I mean families, elderly folks who don't think of themselves as disabled. A lot of them, I think the reason they don't bring it up in politics is because they literally can't imagine what a solution would be. So they're not even saying, well, we need this. Most people, they don't know what they need. They're like, well, that's what happens when you get old. You go to a nursing home or whatever. There's a lot of unquestioning that goes on.
And the other thing that I'm really aware of as a professional is how much it affects our employees that have caregiving needs, both, a generation that they're caring for of older individuals, or loved ones who may be younger, and it impacts so much of our community beyond just our immediate homes, right? It impacts someone's ability to be present and available for their employment and things like that. It's quite pervasive. Fortunately, I think we're talking more about that because we're coming out of the closet, if you will, a little bit, where people have maybe kept some of those struggles to themselves in the past and are now more openly talking about them and seeking solutions.
And it's also, this is a great place for disability activists to get involved and say, because there is more attention, I think, on long-term care as a family issue, which is what we've just been saying is something that should happen. But I think there's also a risk that if it becomes seen entirely as a family issue, that in some cases people with the actual disabilities can again get left out of the conversation because it's all about the caregivers. And this is where some coalition building is really important, that while there's interest maybe is going up a little bit, and candidates have offered things, family care situations and, tax breaks and what have you, that all may be very good. The disability community has to be in there saying, you know what, some of us want to be independent even of our families, and just don't look at this and think automatically that it's parents caring for adult children or sons and daughters caring for elderly parents forever. There need to be independent options as well.
Yeah, my son surprised us. We didn't think it would happen so soon, and at 19 he said, guess what, I need to get out of here, you guys. I need my own joint. And it was a little sooner than we had thought that it would be. And so yeah, you're absolutely right, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. So yeah, and so the next topic that I wanted to chat with you about is education, and not a day goes by where since the pandemic that I haven't talked to at least one individual, whether it's a teacher or a family member during the remote learning, that hearing how COVID has caused chaos in most homes, but With special education households, the stress is beyond intense. Services are lacking. So it's really bringing this topic, I think, even more to a head during this particular time. What should voters expect from candidates in how we prioritize education in this election?
Well, this is not my strongest area of knowledge. And, I have lots of thoughts on very specifics with long-term care and employment and such. Education is a little bit more of a gray area for me. I think, so I don't have prescriptions. I would say, especially for COVID, in the context of COVID, the main thing is to just keep reminding candidates that we're part of this, we need attention. Things need attention. And to please, especially do not make decisions that take it off the table. Like, it becomes a tempting time for people to quite literally say, well, we're going to put aside these things because we don't have the time and money to do it now, right? There was a bit of a push early in the pandemic to literally suspend like IDEA regulations, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, special education regulations, for the duration of the pandemic as sort of well, let's take that responsibility off the schools, as if it's some kind of an extra that in hard times we could set aside. That is what needs to be fought. What they specifically should do, I don't have the answer to that, because I don't know what's the right way to do remote education, especially perhaps in special education setting, but just because I don't know, and not every parent is going to have all the answers, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be saying, do not forget us, do not set us aside. This is a bad situation, but that doesn't make it okay to just say, well, we don't have the time for you now. And I do think there's that temptation, because frankly, in good times, there are people who kind of think, below their breaths, we just don't have the time for these people.
Yeah.
And we constantly have to fight for that.
Yeah, it's not an extra. And particularly when services are, baked into the school day, it's an unbelievably difficult. So Americans with Disability Act is 30, right?
Yeah.
So we've solved all those problems and everything is fixed now, right? Is that right? We're good.
Yeah, not so much. No, I mean, we do hear that a lot, and it's the weirdest thing, I think, is when it is used as an argument to shout down a disability activist. And I've literally seen that happen in social media and in person. Like, you say, well, I can't find a restaurant to go to, or I can't find a grocery store where I have proper access, and people almost literally yell back at you. But there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, as if we must be lying, because they remember back in 1990 something about a law, and so that's it, right? Well, no, it's not. Any more than the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended racism, right? It was never going to happen in that cleanly, and it hasn't for the ADA. There's still a lot undone, and which is not, again, it's not a choice between saying the ADA solved everything and I hate the ADA. Sometimes there's that kind of rhetoric too, like people saying, even disability activists saying, oh, poo on the ADA because it didn't solve everything. Well, yeah, I mean, it's still important. It accomplished a lot. It's just not everything.
Yeah. And as it relates to accessibility, I'm particularly aware during this time of COVID that we're talking about physical space, but also digital space has perhaps become a little bit more recognized as a barrier, given that we're doing everything remotely like we are right now. So how can voter engagement impact this? What do you see as it relates to this topic of accessibility?
it's really hard to say how it's going to play out. I mean, there's online accessibility in general, for which there are, just like the ADA, there are already regulations for that. And that's just a matter of enforcement. The regulations for online accessibility already exist. And as far as I know, they don't need to be changed or improved. You know, other experts may think differently, and that I'm totally open to that. But the other thing I think we're going to have to watch is how this all relates to things like employment and education, because one thing I've heard from a lot of disabled folks is this sort of weird feeling of like, this pandemic is terrible, it's an incredible hardship, but those of us who have been able to work from home using because now everybody's doing it, or everybody who can do it is doing it and relying on it, including the employers. All of a sudden, this thing which we've kind of been advocating for a long time and been told is just not acceptable, is now standard operating procedure, right? I know a lot of disabled folks who've said, you know, they've tried to get work at home situations set up, even part of the time, so that, yes, they mostly go to the office or the workplace, but, you know, when their disabilities are really bad or something, they could be at home, and have been told, nope, that's not good enough. You have to be here. And the same with school. You know, you have to attend class all the time, and, you know, online, I don't have time to do online stuff, and forget about it. Well, now everybody's doing it. And a lot of us are wondering, well, is that going to break new ground for us that keeps going? And then the other thing is, you know, what happens when we do have to go back to work, and what's going to happen to employment rights and the ADA when you mix in the dangers of COVID and maybe having had COVID. And again, will online options stay open to us, or will people be so excited to get back to normal that they say, well, that's done with that. We don't have to do that anymore. Then we'll be left out again.
Yeah, and it ties, as you said, it ties back to so many things, not the least of which is employment. And I'll say this as someone with a disability, folks with my diagnosis, only about 25% are known to work. And so it's because my firm has been an anywhere, anytime culture that I was able to successfully continue working despite my disability. And as you said, now with so many folks having been introduced to the concept of remote working, getting a crash course in how do you make that work, let's keep pushing for it. I think at the constituency base, that's something that we get to continue to push for, just like, as you said, regarding education, to continue to push for the things that that continue to be important even after November 3rd has come and gone.
And I should say at the same time, though, that it really only works for those types of jobs that can be done online. Like if you are a greeter at Walmart, online doesn't really work as far as I know, or, you know, physical labor types of jobs, which a ton of people with disabilities have those jobs. So, you know, let's not forget that there's a whole other group of us that still haven't had that option and are still making very tough choices right now.
Very tough choices. Am I willing to get sick potentially because I need to do that? Which leads us to safety. And I think that that's no small thing, particularly amplified during the pandemic. And you write about ableism and medical and policing practices that can heighten the dangers that disabled people encounter. Can you talk about this and what voters and candidates can do?
Well, and this also, again, relates back to long-term care, because, you know, a huge percentage of the people that have died from COVID were people, literally more people in nursing homes and other institutional settings and group homes and psychiatric places, and, you know, all sorts of congregate care. It's just a bad place to be in a you know, outbreak of infectious disease. Here in upstate New York, we've, for instance, we've been very lucky throughout the pandemic until just a week ago or so, and a nursing home in the county south of mine has had an outbreak of COVID. And it's like, you know, it's just so frustrating and so frightening. So that relates to safety and long-term care, and just even when it all started, when the pandemic started, the first things we all heard, right, were reassurances to the public that it won't be so bad, in a sense, because the main people who will get it are people who are already sick and elderly. And it's like, oh, great. Thank you very much. That's such a comfort. And still get that a little bit, that sense of, for people who want to argue that it's not a big deal, one of their go-to arguments is, well, most of the people who get sick and die were already, you know, kind of weak and disabled and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and I know, Andrew, there was a flurry of panic amongst a number of us related to potential shortage of ventilators, right?
Yeah.
And choices being made about who would and would not be prioritized in the event of shortages. And so I think that speaks to what you're saying, which is the ableism attached to whether or not we are all considered of equal value.
Right. And
right.
I don't want to like get more and more depressing, but just to say that for myself, you know, I use a ventilator at night, and I you know, and talking to other vent users too, I don't think there's, with the possible exception of police interactions, it might be the most frightening thing as a disabled person, right, is the prospect of being in the care of the medical system and the possibility that they might make an actual decision to not treat you because you are already disabled, right?
Yeah.
There's not, you could not come up with a worse and more terrifying scenario than that.
Yeah.
That's not like getting hit by a car.
Yeah.
Right? That's practically on purpose. And I think that's what really triggered a lot of the response. I do think it's interesting, and I don't want to get too far into, you know, partisan politics, but it is kind of interesting that both sides, to some extent, have addressing this issue, and that, you know, in some states, it's been resolved in a good direction to pinpoint policies that are discriminatory and say it's not acceptable. And the Justice Department has done a decent job of saying this is not okay. And, you know, some of the folks on the right side of the spectrum have been right there with that, in saying it's not okay to just take treatment away from somebody just because they're disabled. So this is one of those places where, you know, ideologies that are often in conflict sometimes overlap in very specific ways. So I'm a little bit reassured by that. But again, like everything else, you have to constantly remind people and going back to, you have to talk about it with your elected officials and your candidates.
So you and I did not intend to get like really deep and dark, but I think I'm not ashamed of making the point that some of these issues are life and death, right? And that there's a sense of urgency for those of us who are on the call. I'm going to guess, to your point, are already engaged and sort of in this community of activism or engagement. And so what I would ask of you is, what would you suggest to those of us who are participating that we could do to make this a bigger circle during this electoral process in the next 60 days?
Are you asking the group or asking me?
I'm asking you, what would you say, what would you encourage us to do, because it's like, if we had 1,000 people on here and many folks who were not typically knowledgeable about these issues and we're kind of learning about it, that would be one thing. But I feel like the folks who are listening to us to some degree are already down the path. What can we do to make the circle bigger?
I would say, and I'm going to make an assumption that the people we're talking to probably already know who they want to vote for at whatever level. And that if you don't, for sure, go look at their websites. I mean, you're on this thing, so you're probably using a computer. You're comfortable with that. If you're at all in doubt about who's doing what, the first thing is you go to the candidate websites, because if they have some kind of policy or views that are relevant, you're going to find them there. And if they don't, you're probably going to find that out pretty quickly too. So assuming you do that and you decide who you want to vote for, talk to other people in your life, particularly other people with disabilities, especially the ones who don't like to talk about politics, who don't care about activism or don't think it does any good, or who maybe disagree with you on politics. Another piece of research that I kind of looked up was a Pew, I don't know what's a foundation, the pollsters, Pew Trusts or whatever, had done around the 2016 election, just before it, in fact, on not just participation, but their political views. And they found the general conclusion was that the partisan voting patterns of people with disabilities were pretty much like everybody else's. They were a little bit more toward the Democratic side, but by like maybe 2 points. Other than that, they're like everyone else, so they're all over the place. So you may know people in your life who have disabilities who disagree with you, but whether they do or not, talk to them. And in my view, tell them specifically as you can the policies that you like and what it would do to make your life actually better. Or if you know them well enough to say how it would make perhaps their life better, right? So if you know that somebody is desperate to get out of a nursing home and you find candidates that specifically know that issue, tell them what it is.
I love that advice, Andrew, and I'm going to say this. If 1 in 4 adults are disabled or have a disability, how could it not touch pretty much everybody, right? And so I love your advice, which is talk to your colleagues, talk to your employers, talk to your family and friends, and talk about the things that matter to you and matter to them. So I love that. Thank you so much for that. And Judy, I'm gonna pass it over to you because I'm hoping that we have some questions here. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
Yeah,
or how does that go?
That's great. That was an amazing conversation. I just have to say, it was so thought-provoking, and it really is so incredibly important. The way you talked about it, Andrew, really, really happy. So for folks who would like to make a comment or ask a question, the best way to do it is through the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. It has 2 little bubbles there. While I'm explaining this, Lorna, if you could please ask on the Spanish line if there's any Spanish questions, and please send me a message if there are any questions. So find the way to have your questions or your comments through the Q&A. You can also put it in the chat. It's just the chat has a lot of stuff going on, so it's hard to keep up on that. So let me start, and both of you can answer these questions. So Christina asks, when my son and I had to go to court to set up his conservatorship, I remember the judge saying to us that he would now lose his right to vote in California. It was something that really bothered me because I believe everyone has the right to vote and didn't want to take that right away from him. My son has significant support needs, including medical issues and developmental challenges. We didn't have a choice at that time to keep his right to vote. Do you know if anything has changed in California, or is there a way that we can adjust his conservatorship so he can vote? So I'm going to just try to answer this first from a California perspective, Andrew, because I know that you're not going to know the way our conservatorship, which is what we call guardianship in California, works. But so first of all, I should say that judges are not supposed to take away people's right to vote when they are conserved. It's actually a separate piece, and Suzanne just had to get off. She's actually an expert on conservatorship. You should know that we at Disability Voices United are really big fans of supported decision-making as your first step, and to avoid conservatorship if at all possible. But but one of the things that we have seen in the state is that when people were conserved, that they were automatically losing their right to vote as well, and that it was a mistake on the part of the judges. There have been really amazing legal experts such as Disability Rights California and Tom Coleman, who have filed individual suits as well as class action suits to reverse that, and have won all of those suits. So if you have, if you are an individual or you are the parent of an individual who has lost their right to vote because that box was checked improperly during conservatorship, you can get that right back to that right back to vote very quickly. One of the things you can do is to use your regional centers. If you're a regional center client, to help you with that, because regional centers were generally involved in getting that conservatorship. And so you can definitely use them. It's on a lot of websites. It's on the Disability Rights California website on the process you go to. It's a pretty easy and straightforward process to ensure that you have the right to vote if you are conserved. So I just want to give that specific topic, but then I want to ask both Andrew and Marianne to sort of discuss the fact that even though whether people are conserved or not, I see it as an issue that some people don't believe that people, particularly those with intellectual disabilities or who are non-speaking, really have the capacity to vote. And I just wanted you both to kind of comment on that.
Andrew first.
I'm sure, well, yeah, I know exactly, I know what you're saying. And I think it's still for some people, it's almost like a common sense reaction. Like if you first say, should people like this, and now you substitute, a derogatory term, have the right to vote, and they'll probably say, well, no, right? Because that's almost still common sense. But I think most people, if they dig down a little bit, would maybe say, well, yeah, maybe yes. And that's probably the thing to work on is to question it. It's like, well, what exactly qualifies you to vote? Like, if I'm terrible at math, does that mean I shouldn't be able to vote? If I forget things in my everyday life to the point where I have to have help to remember to do things, well, that's a thing, but does that mean I don't know what I believe in, right? And then you have people say, well, you could be influenced by other people. Well, I mean, aren't we all sort of influenced by other people? Like everybody who grew up in a household where mom and dad, mentioned their political beliefs is influenced by that. Does that mean that they should all be not allowed to vote? Or should you have to write a personal essay to show that you have independent thought? I mean, we don't ask this kind of thing of anybody else except people with disabilities. And even then, only certain people with disabilities. So you can see how arbitrary it is. And I think when you point that out, it becomes, you see how silly it is.
Yeah, and Andrew said it well. I don't know that there's any reason for me to add to it, but I will anyway, because I'm so passionate about it. But in the 2016 election leading up to that, my son was so passionate and spent far more time researching candidates than I did. I'll be quite candid, and actually put together comparisons of policies and issues and spent months doing so and knew exactly who he was voting for and why. So much like Andrew said, folks on the outside meeting Liam may have questioned whether he was capable of doing such a thing, and indeed he was. And as you said, Judy, both individuals who are conserved and non-conserved, I know countless people who are so jazzed by the political process and voting, who many folks would on the surface have said that they would not deem them to be someone who should be in that process, and are probably some of the best voters that we have going. So anyone on this call who's listening, I would say, if that hadn't occurred to you, please really reconsider the folks who are in your life who probably could be voting. On our Disability Vote California website, we have a number of fantastic plain language materials about the voting process and about how to look at policies and issues, and it's designed specifically for that reason.
Well, yeah, and I'd say that is important too, is that on the, while we say, yes, people should be presumed to be competent to do this, on the flip side, it will help to have really good faith efforts to explain stuff to people in ways that aren't trying to spin it, right? I mean, so influence can be an issue, and you have to have a real effort to explain it in as neutral a way as possible. But that's not that hard. So let's do that.
Yeah, I just want to put a little plug for what we're going to have going on in the future here at Disability Vote California. We're going to have a whole webinar on supported decision-making and voting to help family members, parents, as well as professional staff who support people with disabilities in understanding what it means to support a person in making decisions, but not making the decisions for them. And we're going to have a lot of these materials to talk about some complex issues. But as advocates for supported decision-making, Disability Voices United, my organization, spends a lot of time talking about the fact that we use supported decision-making every single day, all of us, every person on earth. No one is truly independent unless you're living off the grid in the middle of a forest, but we are all interdependent. I can tell you that on the ballots, I don't know if it's like this in New York, Andrew, but on the ballots in California, they are just pages and pages and pages long. We have a very robust proposition system in California, and they're often contradictory. Like you'll have one special interest having something on the ballot, and then the opposition will put their own on the ballot. And so it becomes very confusing. We have to vote on judges in LA County, and sometimes we'll have like 15 judges, and it's like, I have no idea, but luckily I use supported decision-making because I have a husband who looks up the American Bar Association and he does a voter guide for California voters for his friends that has become kind of, it's gone viral, really. He has like hundreds of followers in his voters guide of like-minded people who are not going to spend the time researching judges or researching some of the more complex propositions, but they know that my husband has a certain way of thinking about things that they agree with, and so they're going to trust him. So I think it's also okay for people with disabilities who may say, you know what, there's some things I want to take a position on and other things that I'm just going to trust. You get like a ballot, a sample ballot from a trade union or a political party you're in, or an elected official you happen to admire who says, okay, I may be the member of Congress, but here are the people in the state level or local level that I've endorsed. So it's okay to take other people's advice on these things. We all do this every day. And we need to respect the fact that one of the things we talk about is that a person without a disability is respected and admired for when they ask advice for important decisions. But somehow when a person with disability asks for advice about important decisions, it looks like they don't have the right to make that choice.
Oh, exactly. I'm really glad you said all that because I think I don't know if it's just an American thing, but there is this sort of, this rhetoric of an ideal voter that somehow they research everything to the ground and like have a perfect objective analysis. And that if you don't do that, if you vote party line or you know, whatever, that means you're somehow inferior. It's not good enough. It's bad. And I just think, but I mean, honestly, in other countries with there are systems where it's actually really normal to decide which party you're in, and you vote. You barely even know the candidate's name. You just vote for your representative because you're for that party, and that's the way you argue out politics. So, you know,
Yeah, and
I don't know if I'd prefer that, but it's a legitimate way to go. It's okay.
It is a way. And I want to just point out, Wesley Witherspoon mentioned something in the chat that I think is really important too, which is you don't have to vote on everything. You know,
Yes.
and not voting on everything should not prevent us from voting at all, right? It's like, if I can't vote on everything, I can't vote on anything. So thank you, Wesley, for that reminder, because I think that that's a really good point, that, you know, how many of us have gone and said, well, you know, these are the things I know about and I've researched and I care about. I'm going to skip a few things because I don't know that, you know, that's something that I'm as knowledgeable about. We've all probably done it. So that's accurate.
Great, thank you. You know, it's talked about both in the chat and in the Q&A that at the local and state level, we have ballot measures, and it's an important way for us to innovate change. And that it's important for us to pay attention to those. Just another little plug is that we plan on taking a few of those. There's a lot on our ballot, and some of them are completely unrelated to the issues specifically around disability, but some of them are generally related to an increase in the state budget or a decrease in the state budget, which has a direct impact on people with disabilities. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on some of these webinars talking about what's on the ballot and those propositions. But I'm wondering how, you know, Andrew, you as an individual who works, who cares about these issues, how do you explain these ballot measures? How do you talk about it in a way that gets people, if it's totally unrelated to disability, how do you get people to understand the importance of them?
Never really tried, to be honest. It's not, you know, and that's another, it kind of refers to another kind of popular, I would say, misconception, which is that there's something wrong with like issue voting or focusing on any particular issue, like that there would be something wrong and narrow about focusing on disability issues. You know, I care about all the issues and I look at all the issues, but I don't write about foreign policy and I don't write about which judges generally to vote for, because that's not the area I've chosen to focus on in talking with other people. I have something, so you know, maybe we don't have to explain all the issues. But I suppose, you know, from your point of view as an organization, you may have to look at all of them. I don't know. I think that's a good question. But maybe just say there are others, all issues have other sources that you can go to. And maybe I would be interested in anybody doing, maybe between elections, a kind of basic civics or like education in politics to kind of help people identify generally what their political philosophy is, so that, again, they have something to go on other than the nitty gritty of every single darn issue. Yeah. You know, like, how do you know if you're a liberal or a conservative? How do you know to what degree you're a liberal or a conservative? I think that's you know, I don't know who teaches that, especially to people with disabilities and people with maybe intellectual or developmental disabilities. I kind of have this imagined thought that nobody wants to try to do that because, again, we're afraid of partisanship. Oh my God, oh, we're going to give them some sort of evil influence. Well, why is it a topic different from any other topic? Other people talk about what their political philosophy is, and some people change them. So maybe that's a thing to look at.
Yeah, I just want to point out something that was written in the chat by Wesley Witherspoon, who's a self-advocate, who's one of our co-chairs of our Disability Vote California coalition. He talks about how voting participation begins in late school years, junior and high school and beyond.
Yeah.
Many people with disabilities do not think that they can vote. We've got to educate the whole circle of support. It's really true. If you're on an alternative curriculum like my son was and never got his high school diploma, he was still, sadly, at the age of 17 and 18, learning the days of the week and the calendaring, which is a whole other issue and topic that's horrible.
Yeah.
But you know, it would been unfathomable for them to actually teach about the upcoming election, which was, by the way, a presidential election year in his senior year in high school. So, you know, that it is so true that it has to be instilled in the education system from teenage years beyond, even in the special education segregated classrooms.
Right. But I should say, I mean, as important as it is, I think we should probably be realistic sitting here about what we're talking about and what a tall order it would be. I mean, how to vote, not so much. I think that's an easy thing, even in today's climate in schools and whatnot. You just need to make sure that they're doing it. Like, give them the basics of like, what do you do to register to vote? You know, how it works. But anything beyond that, in today's climate, I can't, I wish we could do it, but I would imagine that in a lot of cases it would raise holy hell, right? You would have parents saying, you're indoctrinating my developmentally disabled kid to vote for the devil, right? There's going to be people who are going to do that. They do that with kids who are not disabled. They scream about schools, you know, indoctrinating and politically, you know, influencing their kids. But I don't know, somewhere I think there should be a way, in good faith, to help people come to grips with what they feel about things and how that translates to politics and voting.
Yeah, I guess I just would want to say this, Judy, you know, is that there's so much in our community where we feel disempowered. And I think where we, you know, as Andrew had said, we can feel vulnerable. We could feel like, you know, the world can be slightly more dangerous for us and things like that. When 1 in 4 adults and voters have a disability, we have unbelievable power. And I think the thing that we're trying to do at Disability Vote California and Crip the Vote in general is to recognize the power we have, and that if we simply came together and harness that, we have, you know, unbelievable influence in terms of making sure that these issues that we just talked about for the last hour benefit the folks who are affected, which, by the way, aren't just those with the disabilities, but basically everybody that, you know, is connected to them. So my ask, if I may, you know, before we end, for folks who are on the call, is just to really use your voice in every way that you possibly can. And I think I would start with the thing that Andrew said that I loved, which is, if you haven't already and you still have any question about candidates, you know, start with looking at what they stand for, because it's very clear when you go on websites and you look at platforms what people do and don't stand for as a starting place, and then openly talk about it. Just you know, I know politics can be emotional and taboo, but have those conversations, because for some of us it can be life and death that we're talking about, and it's an urgent matter.
Yeah, I agree. There's another question that is really important, and we need to spend more time on this as a coalition. Oftentimes, I have found it difficult to find parents of older teens and adults with disabilities to be part of any advocacy efforts, because they say they are tired or burned out, or they've put their time in already. after having to fight for so many years, which I completely understand as a parent. But we need as many voices as possible. Do you have any suggestions of how we can get them engaged? And that's really the whole conversation around caregivers generally, not just parents of children with developmental disabilities. So Andrew, how would you answer that?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be against them taking a vacation. You know, we have major elections every 2 years, really major ones every 4 years. I mean, you don't have to be constantly a full-time activist. And if you're a parent who has spent the last 12 years or so, or I should say 18 to 21 years, fighting like a dog for your kid, and you're kind of now at a place where you are taking a pause, that's fine, actually. But at the same time, again, going back to just having conversations, I think maybe all you need to do is remember once in a while when you're talking, and I'm talking to parents, when you're with coworkers, your neighbors, your friends, especially when the topic of politics come up, you don't have to be a professional activist or advocate to say, you know, here's a thing, you know, I have a kid with a disability, and here's an angle on what we're talking about, and then leave it at that. You don't have to go into again, you don't have to be a full-timer, but take those little opportunities to just poke into the conversation with a point of view that is different from other people's and what that means. And that's a big help right there.
You know, I so appreciated how you started answering this question by just acknowledging that parents sometimes just need a break. And that's one of the big issues is so many parents don't have a way to take a break, particularly during this time of COVID. I speak to so many caregivers who are absolutely overwhelmed right now. And we have to acknowledge that. I think starting by acknowledging how this time is really creating trauma for everyone. And I think I just in 20 years from now, we're going to look back and say, this is why 20 years from now, we're doing what we are because of how we were traumatized in 2020. But I wanted to get to a question that came from the Spanish line, which is, could you just explain what Crip the Vote is?
Sure. It's mostly based on Twitter. It's a conversation that just keeps going on and on and on about politics and voting and policy of disability issues, anything connected with those things. And we use Crip the Vote is a Twitter hashtag. So it mechanically, all you have to do is say a thing in a tweet and put that on it. And everybody who follows that hashtag sees everything that everybody says. It's hard to explain, but you know, once you start doing it, it pulls the conversation together, and that little phrase with the hashtag is what makes it come together. And again, we are nonpartisan. We don't tell people who to vote for or who not to vote for, but we're fine with anybody coming in and saying, if they want to say, well, my favorite candidate is this, and here's why, that's totally fine. So it's not that everybody has to be like super objective and like not partisan, but the three of us who organize the events and do things are trying not to say, well, we're all in for this candidate, because we feel like that will immediately put up barriers around the conversation that we don't want it to be there. Right. And we try to be friendly and welcoming to everybody, regardless of opinion. We don't guarantee that everybody's going to be nice to you all the time. If you say something that everybody really doesn't like, you will get criticized probably, but we'll try to keep it civil. It's pretty friendly compared to some online conversations. And we also, part of the effort is when there are debates or actual events like live events, we usually live tweet what's going on. So we have immediate conversations while they're happening. And we also do scheduled chats that are hour-long, all on Twitter, with questions put up ahead of time so that people can prepare answers on certain topics like voter accessibility or a particular issue like long-term care or something like that. We do them roughly once a month. The last few months, we've kind of been holding off because of COVID and letting people do what they have to do for that. But we're starting to pick up again with scheduled chats. And yeah, it's fun. It's just a way to kind of get a sense of what people with disabilities who are into politics are talking about. And we also try to hope to get candidates interested in looking at it to find out what we're talking about. And we find that they kind of do a little bit. Some of the candidates in the primaries, we did have chats with Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren had chats with us that were scheduled where our folks could talk to them. So they kind of noticed, and it's been fun and it's interesting.
It's great.
Join us.
So if somebody is not a Twitter person, they're not on Twitter, is there another way to join this conversation?
There is. We do have a Facebook page where mostly what we do is we post articles that we think are relevant and interesting, and we put them up there and people can chat about them and talk about them, whatever, on Facebook. And we also have a blog, and I think somebody just posted that.
Thanks, Zoe.
Ed did, yeah. We have a blog where when we want to communicate something a little bit longer than just a quick tweet announcement, we put it up there. And it's also a place to find out what's happening. Like if we're going to do a scheduled chat, we'll put a notice up there. So there's that too.
And I'll do a commercial for Andrew's blog as well. Andrew, would you give the information on that?
Oh, yes. Well, it's my own blog. It's www.disabilitythinking.com. I haven't really added to it in several months. When I started writing for Forbes, that kind of took over, and I just moved over to doing that. I post my Forbes articles there too, although I'm behind in posting there. But if you want to go, you can look back at stuff that I've written really much more off the top of my head. If people don't know what a blog is, it's kind of like a diary. So not everything on there is going to be super well thought out, or the farther back you go, the more weird and silly it gets, I find. But it kind of marks my development in talking and thinking about disability issues for over a bunch of years.
That's great. So appreciate that. I'm just looking to make sure we answered all the, oh yeah, there was just a question about suppressing the disability vote. What concerns do you have around that?
Right.
So it's the general voter suppression.
Well, general voter suppression, I definitely am worried about. I don't know how much consciously disability voter suppression is happening. I don't think it really has to. What I mean is, I don't think that people have to try that hard to suppress the disability vote because there's so many barriers to begin with. There have been some fairly nasty incidents over the last few years that involved the disability community, like closing down polling places in Georgia in largely Black communities, right, as a way probably to suppress the Black vote. And the reason they closed them were because they weren't accessible by strict ADA standards. So using disability rights to suppress Black votes, and the disability community was like in this position of saying accessibility is important, but this is not the way to do it. It's like, oh my goodness. So yeah, it's a mess. And I think it's one of those areas where disability and other marginalized people and their needs are definitely overlapping a ton. And I think it's important to say that we should never think of disability issues as entirely standalone, especially in competition with other people. I do hear people will occasionally say, to try and defend disability rights will say, well, all these other groups get all the attention and we don't get any, which is kind of like ridiculous and silly and pointless and wrong. So yeah, I think we should all be concerned about voter suppression. I do think it is related to what we were talking about earlier. There are definitely people who still believe and have always believed, this is a history thing, have always believed that democracy is for certain people, right? I don't think we should consider that view shocking. I think we should consider it terribly wrong, but it's not unheard of. And there are, historically, this is one of the whole conflict of democracy was that people definitely would think only certain qualified people should run affairs. Right. Democracy says, no, that's not the way it is. It's not just certain people. But even people who say they defend democracy still have some of those lingering beliefs, and we should recognize that. Mm-hmm. and realize that we still have to fight that battle.
Well, that was an important way to end this webinar. I want to thank you so much, Andrew Pulrang, from Forbes and Crypt the Vote, and just a general amazing human being. I want to thank Marianne Kehler for moderating the fireside chat with Andrew, as well as our Why I Vote testimonials by Kisha Weller, Suzanne Bennett Francisco, and Sara Iwahashi today. We will post this webinar on our Disability Vote California website, as well as our YouTube channel. And we want to thank everybody. We'll be back next week with another webinar, and please get involved. Go to our website, disabilityvoteca.org. Thanks everybody, and be safe out there. Take care.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Judy.